You're listening to Food Tech Talk, supply chain insights from farm to fork, a podcast discussing the latest trends and technology in the food and supplement industries, featuring conversations with regulatory experts, quality and safety champions, and thought leaders across the industry. I'm your host, Lydia Adams. Let's jump right in. Welcome to Food Tech Talk, supply chain insights from farm to fork. Today, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Steven Sims, an accomplished food safety and quality assurance expert with extensive experience in corporate, raw material supply, and manufacturing environments. Most recently, Dr. Sims served as the Director of Food Safety and Quality Assurance for North America at Mori, where he oversaw the development and expansion of quality management systems. Throughout his career, he has led over 100 major food safety audits and launched more than 250 new products. Steven's expertise spans FSQA auditing, GMP self-auditing, and foreign material controls, making him a leading figure in the industry. Welcome to the show, Steven.
Lydia, thank you. Thanks for those kind words.
Yes, absolutely. So, obviously you have a lot of experience that I wasn't able to get into in your bio. So to start us off, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about your journey in the food industry and within food safety.
Sure. So I started out originally in the UK. I was born in the UK, and I started out as a chemist. I gained a degree, undergraduate degree, and a postgraduate degree in chemistry, and then by a little bit of a journey, I ended up here in the US, starting out as a project management manager for a large food and beverage company here in the Northeast. And very quickly, I started my journey across into quality, into contract manufacturing quality. And really, that was where I learned my craft. I started auditing very early on, often with a number of other significant, other experienced auditors. And over a series of 8 to 10 years, basically built my craft, visiting some fantastic facilities here in the US, a significant number overseas, and really, then most recently moving into more corporate quality positions, supply chain quality positions, and then most recently, again, having a fantastic time at a startup up in Boston, working on as we were commercializing, taking a silk protein from silk cocoons and turning it into a food safe, edible packaging.
Very interesting stuff. And it seems like you've gone from, large companies to startups across the board. So, thinking back through your career, can you tell us more of like a defining moment that really shaped your approach to food safety and quality management across the companies that you've worked for?
Sure. I'll start off almost with an auditing example, because again, when you visit a significant number of locations, after a while, you start to pick up some interesting trends, and they're not always the ones that you expect. And so I often quote these to folks. On average, you might expect that a relatively new facility or a brand new facility may in fact be in the strongest position on its food safety and quality elements. It will be cleaner, the equipment will be newer, and a lot of bad habits won't have occurred. However, I started to see some interesting anomalies. I visited a fantastic older dairy facility, repurposed dairy facility in the south of France, was in fact fantastic. It was clean, it was well maintained, despite the fact that some of the walls were over 100 years old, and yet was managing to run a quality system very effectively to create fantastic products and in that instance, protect my brand. Then perhaps at the other extreme, I visited one facility that had just spent multi-million dollars on new capital equipment, new teams, new floors, new walls, and so on. And yet within 3 to 4 short months, just a poor approach, a poor background culture of food safety and quality. Already the equipment was looking dirty. Already it was covered in torn bits of paper and sticky tabs and so on. And already you could see where the risks were starting to come in for foreign material inclusion in products and just a poor way of working. And so, for me, those are some of the kind of interesting things I've seen along the way.
I love those experiences because it's kind of not what, you would think is how it would be. And then as you go through your career, you're seeing it's not, it's not all about the new glitzy environment and all of that stuff. It's really about those, those protocols and making sure that you're doing what needs to be done. So talk to me a little bit more about your audits that you've been involved with. What are the common challenges that you've encountered with FSQA audits, especially, with international sites?
One of the elements that I had to kind of disprove to myself and perhaps others in the team early on is, generally speaking, the challenges that you experience within the US or my home of the UK or Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and so on, those food safety and quality challenges are pretty much the same. The only difference is the language that the documents are written in or the language that folks speak. What's important is trying to apply, when you're a US brand and you're trying to guarantee the same level of quality for your product across the world, it's looking to apply that same standard universally at all those different locations. And so from an auditing perspective, in time, it took a lot of time to kind of calibrate, for example, a team of different auditors traveling to different parts of the world to make sure they're applying the same standard appropriately, but then adjusting some because, again, sometimes different local regulations push things in slightly different directions, sometimes slightly different construction codes and so on, the quirks of the FDA versus, some of the other international organizations. So, you have to kind of balance those two different elements.
I know you kind of see yourself also as a brand protector, and branding is, my bread and butter in marketing. So tell me how those worlds collide, with auditing, with standards, and with protecting a global brand. How does the auditing world play into that?
For me, it's a huge element. I mean, one of the main reasons for having, FSQ teams is to protect your brand, is, at a simple level to produce a consistent product that backs up any particular marketing claims you're making or ensures you have consistent product on shelf so that you can, keep your retailers happy. But then really more importantly, on a food safety level, it takes one incident, whether that be a recall or otherwise, you can create such incredible damage to a brand. For a young company, you could essentially destroy it. For an older, more established brand, you could create concern and distrust in consumers' minds, and then consumers will often then switch away from your brand. So for me, it's it's often seen more as a compliance element. Every 2 years we will visit this facility, check them out, show that we care about our brand, and so on. But often it's significance for the opportunity to see the product and correct small issues whilst they stay small before they become large. For me, was critically important. Again, I was fortunate. I had some very receptive leadership in my time, and I was able to expand what was a relatively modest check-in once every 4 years at some locations to increasing the frequency on a risk-based schedule. And so for me, I always used to say it's the best $200,000-$300,000 worth of money that the company's spending to protect multi-million-dollar brands.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you were at Ocean Spray for 15 plus years or so. Talk to me about that, because that, seems like, again, such a large brand and such a big responsibility to, have so many locations. And how does that differ then, to your experience with, let's say, the startup, that you were most recently working for?
I did 11 years with them. I did a year as a project manager. In between being a sensible PhD chemist at Unilever and being a sensible, FSQ professional here in the US, I was a professional sailor for 5 years. My only way to transition was I left Unilever more as kind of a project manager. And so I tried to spin my sailing time. I was doing a lot of project management, and I joined Ocean Spray as a project manager. But then I started out originally as their international quality manager, became a senior international quality manager, and then eventually we merged the overseas team with the North American team and created this global role. So it was one of those interesting kind of career paths that it just kind of happened organically. And I started out, I think it was with 22 locations, and I finished up at 82. Again, I think it's an oversimplification, but to say, a lot of people had always imagined that the international side was this strange, unknown element that was very confusing and impossible to consider. I would say it's all the same things. People aren't cleaning. It's the same problem in Taiwan as it is in somewhere in Ohio. It's all the same stuff. And so, I wouldn't want to oversimplify and say, the regulations don't have some impact, but, the most of the regulations aren't that far apart. I guess it really comes down to a kind of a focus. When you're fortunate enough to have one or two locations, you can tend to be much more hands-on. You're maybe even located at the facility, as I was in my last role in Boston. You can poke your head into the facility every single day, which has an advantage. It shows you care. You get that firsthand input on how things are going, and also you can assist with input on what's the best appropriate way to correct something or to fix something or to grow something. Once when you look at those larger companies with a very spread out supply chain, you end up having to come up with a different approach. It's not practical to have a team of 25 to 50, representatives showing up at these locations on a high frequency. And so, in the end, we found most success with developing very strong kind of quality manuals and expectations, which we would share with these locations. One thing, Lydia, again, took me a while to learn, but eventually, again, we all get a little wiser as we get older, was that typically if you told locations what you wanted, then generally they would do it. Early on, I would see more issues where there was a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation or a lack of clarity, let's say, from us as a brand. And so in the end, we would invest significant amount of time developing these, fairly lengthy manuals, because again, there were responsible folks at each of these locations who would spend time reading through them. What have you changed? Well, when you work in various different product categories, you often tend to have quality issues that are a little more specific to you or to your product range, or that your consumers care more about. In cranberry is the cranberry color, that wonderful deep red. Consumers notice if it's not deep red and if something is changing and so on. And so we would spend time focusing on those elements so that for the partner who may be making your product amongst, again, a range, they could be making 50 other brands' products. It's become very common nowadays. A lot of contract manufacturers have a large portfolio of customers. And so in the end, that was one of the key approaches that we would take to find success when we had these kind of large, diversified supply chains.
So let's talk about GMP self-auditing. How is this critical for maintaining food safety standards for companies?
I guess I'd say for me, again, having visited so many locations, eventually I came to this kind of conclusion that there were the two elements of it that we audit that had the most direct correlation between, if they were good, then the overall audit would go well, would be the overall cleaning and sanitation at the location, and then secondly, how effective their self-auditing, their GMP self-auditing was. Because for me, it's as an outside auditor, you get a snapshot. It's often not particularly realistic. Often the facility's been a little tidied up before folks arrive. Often they may put their best operator team on because, hey, we got outside visitors. But as a facility yourself, you know your facility better than anyone else does. You know where you have problems. You know where the skeletons are buried. And so, if you can have an open and honest self-auditing process, and most important, most companies can start that process. They often create a long list of non-conformances, but typically the challenge and the difference between those who are successful and less successful is how good they are at actually addressing those non-conformances in a consistent way, that means they don't recur. Or if something does recur, that they recognize it and say, okay, we tried this simple fix, we have something more fundamental, we need to go a little deeper with our corrective actions. And so for me, a strong, effective self-auditing program, again against that core FDA, GMP standard and so on. It was written by FDA to give strong guidance in that area. And it's like, if you follow it with your own internal self-auditing on a, monthly frequency, and so on, you'll tend to nip many of the issues, early. And, when we get into these kind of Swiss cheese models for failure modes and so on, you're plugging the holes in the Swiss cheese on a high frequency. And typically the larger significant issues then have much lower risk of occurring.
And it sounds like, a strong food safety culture and an honesty about, what potential problems exist is kind of essential in order to really successfully do a self-audit. Have you seen any situations where there needed to be kind of like a turnabout in that type of culture, or how do you think that plays into the auditing process?
I think you raise a useful point. I think it's, what does failure often look like, or weak GMP self-auditing processes end up with one team, usually FSQ, creating a list of corrective actions for a different team, typically manufacturing operations, maintenance, which then don't get acted upon, or not, they don't get the significant focus that's required. And then they hang around. They get left as a gap, as a deviation that sits. And if it sits for long enough, it becomes the norm. And then we end up in these kind of deviation downward spirals until eventually it ends up in a larger issue. So that relationship between the auditing group, again, typically FSQ, and those who are often responsible for acting, for me, that's a critical part. Now, again, FSQ has a responsibility in this. If you're always the team coming in with the bludgeon to attack other teams, you're a disaster. You're the reason why we have all these problems. Why didn't you act? The world's littered with folks who took that approach in their career and didn't last so long. There's a right way and a wrong way to go about that. But done successfully, when both teams are working well in concert, those are the ones who tend to make forward progress. They can find their issues. They can come up with workable solutions. They don't have to be the most expensive. They just have to be effective. An important part, Lydia, when the relationship's working well, there's some exceedingly smart people outside of FSQ who also have, if you explain to them what a non-conformance is, what's the intent, what are we trying to protect against, they can come up with some incredible solutions. And so when they're engaging more, you often tend to find much better solutions, much longer lasting solutions that others are bought into. Failure looks like an FSQ team coming along saying, well, I heard once you could solve this with this solution. This is what I'm going to demand. Often folks aren't bought in, and you can imagine this, your chance of long-term success then starts to fail.
Talking with a lot of folks in the space, it feels like the internal collaboration of, food safety and quality being across the board is really where you're going to find a lot of success, rather than having, food safety quality over here. That's kind of its own department. Like, it's when everybody's, reaching towards that same goal and they understand what it means. And to your point, what success and failure looks like that's when things are rolling. And it sounds like you've had that same sort of experience.
For sure. Another area that I have kind of mixed opinions. When it works well, software solutions can be fantastically useful in self-auditing. Non-conformances get properly documented, they get rated. The software allows those responsible to put in reasonable timelines. But then most importantly, a lot of this software has some pretty easy kind of scorecarding or dashboarding, which is often, if you have a properly engaged senior leadership team, then starts to give them the picture that they need Am I devoting enough time in maintenance for corrective actions in this area? Am I not? Uh, and so, I wouldn't always say that software is the ultimate solution, but it can be a very useful tool. And there are a number of good systems that are out there that help folks document these types of things. Again, I've seen it run. If everyone's on the same page, you can run it in Excel. However, the days of that, even at my stage in my career, it's like you've got to start moving away from some of these older tools and so on.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point because I love to talk about technology and, in your career, how have you seen that change? Because, I chuckle when you mention Excel because I know, a lot of, I've heard that a lot before of, well, we're just running this on Excel and at some point it can become unmanageable, right? So how have you seen that technology landscape, make a difference in the auditing process over your career?
For the auditors themselves, sometimes, that using various software platforms and so on can help. They can help do a better documentation of what's actually happened. The old school way of scribbling notes on a questionnaire sheet, that would often the audit then wouldn't be written up for maybe a couple of weeks. Maybe sometimes people, again, back in my time, I would often do back-to-back audits. We travel to one region of the world and we try to get in, 2 or 3 audits in one trip. It has its disadvantages. You can often come home and then you're trying to kind of work, well, what did I mean? What was I seeing at that location? And so the software systems, they can help a lot, I think, with accuracy, which is important. There's nothing worse than receiving an audit where an auditor has tried to make a non-conformance and you're not really quite sure what they're saying. But I think perhaps more importantly, again, done well, there's the reporting from these systems, particularly as actions are taken to address corrective actions. They can help give senior leadership good snapshots. As an auditor, often you perhaps like the floor. Often I would give debriefs to senior leadership on some locations. And you're like, I've spent 2 days of my life somewhere, hot and far away. I'm going to orate for at least an hour and take my time in the spotlight. That's interesting, but it's not really what senior leadership needs. What they really need to know is, this location, is this an acceptable risk profile for me, or is it drifting to unacceptable? Most instances once you have a large portfolio of contract manufacturing, you often have the advantage you can move volume when you need to, and so the software systems that allow scoring and scorecarding help senior leadership to ask the right questions in terms of, okay, this is interesting, but should we move away? Is it a go, no-go decision?
Let's talk a little bit about foreign material control measures. So, how do you monitor the effectiveness of FM control? How do you reduce risk? Maybe tell us a little bit of your experience in that area.
Sure. I mean, for me, it's important to understand. Most facilities for a number of years they build their HACCP plans. They decide they want to control for something. In food and beverage, we're either using filters and so on for products that you can filter. But often, once you get beyond that, you're relying on metal detectors or maybe X-rays and so on. And it's important to understand really, what they can control for and what they don't control for. And so you sometimes see that, run well, and where I always truly say, the plant leadership can sleep well at night. They know that their systems are working well. They know their team understand what they indicate and what they don't indicate, and that, the facility team will act appropriately should they get a finding. But sometimes people can come to the wrong conclusion that, if you get a single hit for metal, that it's like, oh, okay, that's good. The machine alarmed, it kicked out the particular package. That's good. We got the one bad one. When in reality, it's giving you an alert that, there could be some, what did you find and what does that mean to you? Are you finding part of something? At which point, the classic is, where's the rest of it? And once you get into, it can get a little harder once you get into finding plastics, which again, your metal detector and so on often aren't going to help you with. What does it mean? Where did it come from? Is it just associated with this batch? Is it a piece of equipment? Is it in fact coming from a raw material? And so for me, there's a lot of nuance goes into good foreign material control that you kind of need to talk a lot about in advance and make sure that folks are on the same page. Otherwise, you either end up with insufficient holds and product with a significant risk going into the marketplace. And again, the world is rife with recalls for green, blue, and red plastic, or the opposite, where you end up having enormous holds, and then you can't hit your manufacturing goals for the month, and so on. So, for me, that's an important part. There's some interesting new technologies coming out, but fundamentally, it's understanding what are they showing you, and then perhaps importantly, what are they not showing you.
It sounds to me like the information you get is the one piece of that, right? And then what you do with it and how you understand it is really very important. So in your experience, what comes next when there is, foreign material, or there is a need for recall, or, the audit comes back and you have these issues? What's the response like, and what can companies do to prepare for that possibility?
Some of it is about appropriate training and understanding, when you go down the potential path for an issue that you find, that you then discover perhaps that you haven't acted as perhaps you would want to have, and that product is no longer under your control. For me, there are a number of elements in that process that have failed to end up all the way at a recall. And so I guess I would be saying it's, training on foreign material control is important. I've been doing some training of myself recently, and some of the certifications, they remind you that the training should extend not just from operators on the plant floor, not just the supervisors, but the benefits of having senior leadership fully understanding, again, these key areas: allergen controls, foreign material control, and so on. Because better understanding there, folks can then understand what is the relative risk of something happening? What could be the consequences to us? Again, if worst case, as we roll downhill to either a very large hold, foreign material can often be, I think there's many instances where really it's a failure at a supplier. Because again, many of those suppliers are doing an element of processing themselves. They're often large facilities, and the chance of inclusion of foreign material at that stage can be significant. And so understanding how that impact to your product. So sometimes, to my mind, it often rolls uphill, and I bring out my other auditing hat and say, raw material supplier auditing also should be a big focus, again, in terms of its, return on investment. Again, you're talking relatively low costs, $1,000 to $2,000 to go do an audit here in the United States. Versus just the on costs and aggravation and loss when you start to have a foreign material issue that's related to a raw material that, of course, often maybe across multiple products that you produced. For me, there's a huge value and a return in that. Absolutely,
and as you said, just it all connects. Managing your suppliers and knowing what's coming into your facility, very important. So looking towards the future and looking ahead, what trends do you see, or innovations that, you mentioned a couple, but, what's kind of exciting you for the future in this area?
We all read the newspapers, we watch the news. I see eventually in time, I see this kind of big data AI approach will ultimately lead to some interesting things for us when companies are willing to share their observations, that will start to then put together a much larger pattern of occurrences of quality issues, be they foreign material, pathogen hits, and so on, that will lead to opportunities to make course corrections. For a company that only buys an ingredient twice a year, you really don't get enough data points yourself to make a judgment call over whether an ingredient is good or bad. But the ability to kind of aggregate across a number of companies can start to help industry address, no, there was an issue here. The the defect rate is significantly higher for this one particular ingredient, this one particular supplier, this category, and so on. So I'm optimistic. I think in the short term, it's difficult. Each company kind of likes to keep its data internal. We all keep it in different formats, again, from the dreaded Excel to various, some people are Microsoft systems, some people are Google systems, and so on. But I see a real opportunity there, particularly I think in the kind of pathogen and those kinds of public health type elements.
So a couple closing questions here. So, throughout your career, what has been really the most rewarding aspect of working within food safety and quality assurance?
I think for me, it's been perhaps the good fortune to be able to build a number of teams. The food safety professionals, they're a little bit of a rare breed. I always describe they're the folks who are in our world who are willing to run towards the fire. When problems occur in manufacturing, usually they're the first to be called, and typically, they don't get to stand down until the issue is fully resolved. And so, I've been fortunate enough to build a number of teams across the companies I've worked for, and work with some amazing professionals. And it's very interesting to see the kind of folks who get attracted to food safety and quality. Some folks come from academia and they're looking to change the world and reduce the amount of foodborne pathogens and so on, and improve public health. And the rest are just kind of interested problem solvers. So, for me, that's been a fabulous opportunity. And again, it's one of the things I enjoy the most. I guess I can give you a little example. I could see, the groups, the loose networks of colleagues and former colleagues. If you go to any one of these large conferences for food safety and quality, you will see these groups huddled together, be it over coffee or over drinks or over dinner. And, they've all got war stories to tell. Some of them have moved on to new companies, but just there's a real interest in understanding what they're doing, helping, giving advice, giving tips, as careers move on and technology moves on and so on. There are things, we're all really trying to help each other. And so for me, that's a kind of an interesting thing, just the characters, these great characters and professionals that you get to work with.
I totally agree. I love being in this industry because I see the passion of, everyone who's working towards this goal of, food safety. And as you said, like, we're an interesting group, right? We're there for many reasons, but we, love to educate and help each other. So totally agree with that. And then alongside that, my next question is also about, I guess, people. So I like to ask my guests sometimes in this industry, who would you like to take to lunch and learn more from?
I would love to go into it. I just recently saw talking up on stage, the head of FDA, head of USDA. I'd love to go to dinner with them. There seems to be a little bit of a trend, I think, in a positive direction to take more science-based assessments of risk and based policy based upon that. Where are the real problems and where will new regulation help move us in the best direction? And so I think it would be fantastic to chat with those guys, maybe a few beers in. And governments around the world they're in a tough position. They're trying to do the right thing, but always those things tend to come at cost to industry, complexity to industry. And so understanding that balance that they're trying to have, and then perhaps talking to where they could see where they've been successful and where they haven't. We're seeing a lot of pushback at the moment on the traceability rule from FDA, and to my mind, I feel it's a little misguided by industry and so on. That we're doing it for the right reasons, but for me, it's an interest. So I feel chatting to those two guys would be very interesting.
Awesome. Well, this was extremely educational and awesome interview. Is there anything that you want to share with the audience that we haven't discussed?
Come back to the basics. From my experience auditing all these facilities, I've been to some of the most amazing. Most people would always, quote the Japanese. Yep, it's true. I've been to some of the most amazing facilities in the world in Japan. I also found one really bad, very poor facility in Japan. And the difference, again, if I was to push on two things, cleanliness and sanitation and good internal auditing. One location knew everything that it needed to know about itself, was very honest with itself, and made corrective actions when it needed to, and was clean and tidy. Clean's always been good. It's always been appropriate. And the other did not. It had perhaps a difficult management culture. A few folks saying that there were problems and they weren't being recognized. They weren't working their way up successfully to senior leadership. And so, to my mind, it's like if you focus on those core elements within food safety and quality, pretty much, again, then stick to your SQF and BRC or whichever code you're under, you'll be in a strong position.
Awesome advice. Well, with that, we're going to end this episode. Thank you so much, Dr. Sims, for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Lydia, thanks for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another bite-sized nugget of food tech talk, supply chain insights from farm to fork. To learn more about Trustwell and its technology platform that connects product formulation, nutrition analysis, and compliant labeling with traceability, recall readiness, and supply chain transparency, please visit www.trustwell.com. Thanks for listening.